One of these clips was filmed at 120 frames per second and slowed down to 20% to fit into a 24 frames per second timeline. And the other was filmed at 24 frames per second and slowed down to match the same speed using optical flow. Can you pick out which is which? Okay, let me zoom in and make it easier for you. Pretty obvious now, right? So I want to talk about optical flow and how it can help you slow down your footage when you didn't film it at the frame per second you needed to slow it down natively. Now, in general, when you film, the best thing you could do is to pick the frames per second and the settings to match what you intend to do with the clip in your edit. So for example, if you know you want to have a clip be in slow motion in your edit, you would want to film in 60 or 120 frames per second and your shutter speed be double that, so when you slow it down, all of the frames are there and you have a natural amount of motion blur. But it can be tough sometimes when you're filming because you don't always know what the edit is going to look like. You don't always know what clips you'll want slowed down. So that's where optical flow can bail you out. Now, if you're familiar with warp stabilizer, you know that you rarely get near perfect results with it if you're putting it on footage that isn't very stable to begin with. And to be honest, optical flow really has the same limitations relatively. Now, the way that optical flow works is simple. When you slow down footage that wasn't filmed at a high enough frames per second, those missing frames have to be filled in. When you use optical flow, it creates those missing frames by using the frames before and after the frames it's creating. Now, optical flow is different from frame sampling and frame blending. So without going too deep into those, with frame sampling, the software takes the frame before and the frame after and it just mixes them together to create the missing frame. So if you had blue and you had yellow and you mix them together, you get green. You didn't create a new color, you simply mix the two together. With frame blending, the software essentially applies a cross dissolve to the frame before and the frame after to blend them together to fill in for the missing frame. So it's basically extending the frame before it and extending the frame after it to be able to cross dissolve the two to fill in the gap. Now, with optical flow, the software is creating the missing frame using data from the frame before and the frame after and trying to figure out what the missing frame should be. Now, at least in Premiere Pro, it's not quite using AI based on the AI we have today, but it is essentially using Adobe's neural engine, which is kind of like AI. So I do think optical flow will get better as it starts to use more powerful AI tools. So when you think about how it works, you probably can start to see scenarios where this wouldn't produce the best result, or worse, it gives you something that's just not usable. So first things first, if there's a lot of movement or motion in your clip, optical flow is not going to handle it very well. And you saw that in the clip at the beginning of this video. It's just not good enough today to be able to figure out movement. And to be fair, how could it really? So you want clips that either have very little movement, or if there is movement, it's subtle movements that don't change drastically from frame to frame. So when you're on your timeline, if you move from one frame to the next, if there's a pretty noticeable difference between the two frames, optical flow probably won't be able to render those missing frames without a lot of artifacts being introduced. The second thing to keep in mind is that you want to keep it subtle. If you have a 24 frames per second clip, trying to slow it down as if it were a 120 frames per second clip is almost never gonna work and actually look good. There would just be too many missing frames that have to be filled in, and unless the clip was pretty static, it's not gonna do a good job. So where this works best is having a 30 frames per second clip and slowing it down as if it were a 60, or a 60 frames per second clip and slowing it down to 120. You really want to have it only have to fill in one frame in between frames that actually exist. If you have a 24 frames per second clip and you want to slow it down as if it were a 120 frames per second clip, that's 96 missing frames that will have to be filled in using 24 frames worth of data. It's just not going to work well. And the clip at the beginning of this video was exactly that. And the last thing, and this really applies for those of you who would want to film in 120 frames per second, but your camera only does 60 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be what it would be if you were filming natively. So in that example, instead of using a shutter speed of 125th of a second, use 250th of a second to simulate the same motion blur you would get if you were filming at 120 frames per second. This way, when you take that 60 frames per second clip and slow it down to 50%, not only will the clip be a bit sharper, which will help optical flow create the missing frames, but it'll have a more natural looking motion blur. So head down to the comments and let me know if you've used optical flow and how well it has worked for you. Thank you for watching this video, and until the next one, take care.